And it also helps publicize organ
It
donation
does,
too.
yes. So, you know, those are definitely the most common myths that we hear when we're out talking in the public and doing programs.
Yeah, I want to talk about how they choose who's going to be a recipient in a minute. Because you're right, one of those myths is that only the rich and famous can do
Right.
it. But another myth too is that people are afraid that they might be too old to,
Yes,
to
or
be an
too
organ
sick.
donor, or too sick.
Yes, people think I may have abused my body when growing up or in college, and we ask that everyone not rule themselves out for donation. We have trained clinical coordinators who evaluate every patient for donation after death. So we have a complete questionnaire to go through and evaluate each organ and tissue for its suitability for transplant to determine that it is, you know, usable, and that age and medical history has nothing to do with
And
with
age
that.
not only older but also younger.
Yes.
Infants can be.
Yes. There was
organ
an
donors,
organ
too.
donor last year in the United States who was 92, and I know organ donors, as sadly as it is, who have been infants. So.
Let's talk more about this myth about the rich and famous, because how exactly are organs allocated to recipients?
When we have an organ donor, we enter their information into a national database through the United Network for Organ Sharing, and that is the national not-for-profit that holds the National Transplant Waiting List.
And the acronym is UNOS.
Yes, UNOS, UNOS. And the UNOS houses that list, and so once we enter the donor information, it cross-references, the computer system cross-references that information with the potential recipient list,
Now,
and that's how the pool of recipients
Now, you
is
said this
found.
is a nationwide database.
Yes.
So are organs literally shared from coast to coast, or are
Yes.
there region? So it's not regional.
Well, it depends on the organ. For kidneys, it can be shared coast to coast. If there's a perfect match out there, literally a perfect match, then it could, your kidney, if you're a donor in Ohio, could go to California very easily, or it could stay locally. It just is a matter of who's the best medical match and who is in the most need.
What does a perfect match mean? What are they looking for when they're matching the donor with the recipient?
There are specific antigen medical markers in your kidneys that I'm not a medical expert, so you have to excuse me if I don't describe this 100%, but there are specific medical antigen markers in your kidneys, and when cross-referencing those blood type and those sorts of things, if there's a perfect match for your kidney, almost like a twin, somewhere out there in the United States, the list will find that.
So an organ can actually survive, when you're talking about coast to coast, an organ can actually survive the amount of time it's going to take to get it from New York to California.
A kidney can, but a heart cannot. Kidneys can be pumped on automated machines to maintain their viability as they travel across the country. If there's a heart recovered, it can only be out of a body between 4 and 6 hours. So you're talking about sharing organs like hearts and livers more regionally than you would be with kidneys, and that might be a national share.
And exactly how are they shipped? I mean, do they just put them in the belly of a plane and then someone comes and picks them up at the airport?
Well, it depends on the organ. For hearts and livers and lungs, they send recovery teams to the donor hospital to recover those organs, and they're packed on ice in a cooler, an igloo cooler. That is one of the things on television that you see that is true.
Where you see the physicians actually coming
Out of the operating room with the cooler and going to the recipient hospital to perform the transplant with that same cooler. With a kidney, it can go, like I mentioned, on an automated machine where it's perfused, and that can travel in the belly of a plane or in the cargo space of a plane, you know, with other passengers. There are different flight options when we're transporting organs. Can go in a car or an ambulance as well.
Now, you mentioned in terms of finding the appropriate recipient that they look at matching. That's one of the criteria.
Yes.
But there must be other criteria as well.
Well, it's really based on who's the best medical match, as I mentioned, who's the...
And is that a number one criteria? I mean, do they look that at number one? That's
Yes.
the number one criteria.
Yes, you have to be medical matched to receive that transplant,
And everyone knows
that donated organ.
Everyone knows that blood type is an obvious. That's an absolute must.
Yes,
that you
I was
have
going to mention blood type, overall body size, weight, and height. But things like if it's male or female, black or white, Hispanic or Asian, does
Irrelevant.
not matter. Doesn't factor into the equation at all. And then two, with some organs, it depends on who is the sickest patient to be at the quote-unquote top of the transplant waiting list.
Who is in the most need, in
Yes,
other words?
Absolutely. So if you match medically and you are the sickest patient, that's how you'll get your organ transplant, because as we mentioned earlier, there are 97,000 people waiting, but only 29,000 transplants happening each year. So that means 18 patients are dying every day waiting on that second chance for life.
What would height and weight have to do? You said that was a criteria that you tried to match height and weight. Why would that be relevant to
Well,
to
if
an
I
organ?
were a donor today, my heart would not be able to be transplanted into, say, maybe a 2-year-old because, I'm a bigger
It's
woman.
simply
and
too
yeah,
large.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. and my heart would do too much work for that little person's body. So that's why that's important in figuring
So
into the
really,
equation.
it's more general. We're not really talking about a 6-foot person as opposed to a 5'11".
No.
It's much more
No.
general
Yes,
than that.
it's very general.
So we're looking at it more at age and size rather
Age
than
really isn't a factor as well. We've had donors in their 60s and their organs go to teenagers. It just depends on, like I mentioned, who's the sickest and best medical match.
Yeah, in terms of age, I meant more like when you look at a 2-year-old or
Oh,
an
yes.
infant, as opposed to someone who really
An
has almost
adult.
reached their full height.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. And what other things are looked at? Now, you've talked about UNOS. You've talked about how the national system works. Is UNOS all over the country, or is there one central registry, or does everyone share the central registry in terms of trying to find donors and recipients and match them?
UNOS is based in Virginia, in Richmond, Virginia. So yes, they have the national transplant waiting list. So if there's a donor in Austin, Texas, or Columbus, Ohio, or Athens, Ohio, that information is entered into the transplant computer database that is held at UNOS. So all of the information is fed into one central location. And the United Network for Organ Sharing then generates the recipient list. And that is based on those things that we've been talking about, regional and local hospitals, and then also the things that we've addressed as well, the medical and match and which patient is sickest. So yes, there is one central location, and that is the United Network for Organ Sharing.
Now, we've been talking about organs as life-saving.
Yes.
Obviously, a kidney is going to be life-saving, a lung, heart, pancreas, all going to be life-saving. Tissues are more life-enhancing, isn't that right?
They are healing for those patients who receive those transplants.
Yeah, and talk more about that. Is that a separate list, people who are actually waiting for tissues as opposed to organs?
Yes, there actually is not a national tissue transplant waiting list because, like I mentioned at the start of our program, one tissue donor can benefit 50 lives. So there's 1 million tissue transplants happening every year, but there's not quite, I don't want to say there's not a need because there is a need, but there's not the wait list that there is for organs. And that's because we have more tissue donors than we do organ donors.
So in other words, there's not a shortage of tissue donors, but there's a great shortage of organ donors.
But if people stop donating, we could have a shortage of tissue donors as well.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because when you hear, I think most people are aware of cornea transplants that can be basically sight-saving.
Yes.
But even when I hear about bone, these are things that I've never heard of either. Talk
The
a little
common
bit.
surgery is ACL repair surgery.
What is ACL?
It's the anterior cruciate ligament, I believe, in your knee. If you've been injured while playing a sport, maybe soccer, or football player Carson Palmer for the Cincinnati Bengals tore his ACL while playing a few seasons ago. He received a piece of donor tissue to repair that surgery, or to repair that ligament in his surgery, and he's since returned to the football field and had a great season last year. So they are really healing for those patients. Other general surgeries like cervical and spinal fusions, for burn patients, the skin that is donated can be obviously life-saving as well.